I'm Darren Lewis. I am the former head of school of Pacific Christian School, which is an interesting thing to say because that's only been true for a very short period of time. I'm also going shortly to be Director of Operations for Sanderson Bible Fellowship, so I'm looking forward to that transition. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you, and I'm trying to model a little bit in what I'm sharing a couple of things. One is in terms of teaching practice, so a teacher by trade, and there's a truism in teaching which is basically tell the people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I'm starting off with a slide that actually just introduces what I'm hoping to talk about this morning. And I hope, we have a series this summer on ordinary people, extraordinary God, and I struggled with who should I chat with you about, and settled on Peter, which I'll unpack a little bit for you shortly, but Peter, rock. And when we think of rock as a metaphor, I mean, the picture that comes to mind for most people is solidness. But rock is used as a metaphor in the Bible in a variety of ways. And so I'm going to lean into a couple of the other ways of looking at rock as metaphor this morning with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about opportunities for growth and the fact that Peter needed to grow and some of the things that happened in his journey in his life. And that Jesus embraces you in your successes and in bold, I said, and in your failures. And you are a work in progress. And a question which I'm going to come back to, how can you let Jesus catch you? So as I was musing on what to do with this in this point of transition, I forgot they gave me this little controller, which hopefully works or not. Whoop, wrong way, or did I? We could start singing again. That would be... Try it again. There we go. So I brought a rock with me. And I thought it was appropriate to bring a rock for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, Peter, rock, Cephas. But the other is that it's a metaphor or a thing that has personal resonance with me. By the way, oh good, there's nobody on camera trying to track me because they'll discover that I tend to move about a bit. The pictures I'm showing... Somebody running back to the camera is like, I guess I can't assume that he's going to stand here. You can probably assume that I'm going to stand somewhere between here and here, because I don't think I'll step off the platform, although when I have preached in past, actually I started wandering around the congregation one time, and that really threw people off. But anyway, so rock, two pictures up here that are of personal importance, and they connect to this rock that I brought with me and transition. The rock that I have with me actually has a word on it. It says shalom. And shalom is both greeting, but it's also a declaration and a prayer for God's wholeness, His completeness, His purposes would be accomplished. And so the two pictures, I have to admit, the one on my left, I assume on your left too, yep, the old decrepit farmhouse, I generated it in AI. I didn't have a picture, but it's amazing what you can do with AI because that looks pretty close to what it looked like. This is Kelowna Christian School. This picture on the right is in Kelowna. There's a pond, Munson Pond. You can see on the right-hand side of the pond, there's a series of white buildings. That's Kelowna Christian School. So that was my former school. And I remember I had a meeting about 2 years into my time as head of school there. Former parent knocked on my door and asked, hey, can I have a few minutes of your time? And I said, sure. And he came in and he wanted to talk about the pond, and he represented the Okanagan Trust. So Land Conservancy. And they said, we have a vision for Munson Pond. And Munson Pond, so the school backed onto it. The farmhouse on the left, again, admitting it's AI, but pretty darn close, that's what bordered the back of the school. So there was basically a junkyard where over many years, various decrepit cars, farm equipment, dead horses, apparently. I never saw the dead horses, but I was told there were dead horses on the ground back there. It looked pretty decrepit. So the guy's knocking on my door and said, hey, we have this vision to do something with Munson Pond, that it could actually be a bird sanctuary. It had to become an important migratory stop. And interesting because it actually isn't a natural pond. It's actually when they built the original bridge across Lake Okanagan, they needed gravel foundation, so they dug up the gravel, they quarried it, and they left behind the hole. And so the hole became Munson's Pond. So it's actually not a natural pond. So sitting there, but it looked like on the left, it was surrounded by trash. And so he was saying, we need people to help us accomplish a vision. And the vision was to transition it to something that would be a lovely park and a spot for birds to stop. So I said, what do you need? And he said, we're short volunteer hours. We've gone for a grant with the federal government, and we need 2,000 hours of volunteer time. And that, to him, that was a big number, but I happened to be head of school of 800 students, and I thought, hey, if there's anything I can volunteer, it's time. So not my own, of course, but no, I actually, I did go out and do some of the work myself, but I volunteered a whole bunch of student labor and time. And for a couple of years, every Wednesday morning for 3 hours, our students would go out and work on Munson's Pond, cleaning it up and planting native Okanagan vegetation. So the picture on the right is much more modern. What I actually said to him when he was in my office, he showed me his diagrams of what they were hoping to accomplish, and I said, hey, we'll do it if. And my if was, I want you to modify the trail network so that the trail actually stops. Our back fence had a gate, and I said, I actually want the trail network to stop at the back fence so our students can literally walk out the back fence of the school and be in this nature conservancy. So this transition, the rock, so I'm leaving the school. The park had been established for 2 or 3 years. I could go on for about an hour on the park, but I won't. And trying to think of what I wanted for a departing gift. And I told the board, one thing I did not want was a watch. That was their tradition. They gave out watches. I had literally bought myself a new watch about 6 months earlier. So, of course, we have the big official going away, and I get my watch, even though I had told them I didn't want a watch. But anyway, so later on with the staff, we had a going away event, and the staff presented me with a rock, which is a kind of an interesting thing to say thank you. But the rock has the word shalom on it. It has the geographic coordinates of Munson's Pond on it, and it has a place of honor had a place of honor in my office. I just brought it home about a week ago. So rocks, they can be a variety of things. One of the things they can be is a metaphor of remembrance. So in the Old Testament, there's a story when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, and Joshua has them build a small tower of rocks at Gilgal, because when later on people are saying, hey, what are the rocks about? It's a prompt to tell a story of God's care and concern for his people and his guidance to his people. So the rock can be a reminder that God is with us. The second thing I'm going to do is read you a story, because I was told, actually I should assume that children are here. So I'm not going to unpack the story a whole lot. I'm hoping it gives some context to what are really devotional remarks. And by the way, when I say devotional remarks, I should probably give you a warning on me and devotions. One of two things has happened in my history of giving devotions. One is I don't make any sense. Typically, I kind of unpack and think through things as I say them. So the last time I gave a major devotion was for the Christian Principles Association. They have an annual conference in Whistler. I did the opening devotions. So it was about a 20, 30-minute talk. But I knew that about myself that I needed to unpack, so I did it 3 times. So I did it for the elementary school staff, and it was horrible. And then I did it for my leadership team, and it was kind of okay. And then I did it for the Christian Principles, and it was pretty good. So I'm just warning you, you're the first group to hear these thoughts. So we're going to read a story together, and hopefully I'll remember to flip the pages as I go. So this is a story called, What Do You Do with a Problem? I don't know how it happened, but one day I had a problem. I didn't want it. I didn't ask for it. I didn't really like having a problem, but it was there. Why is it here? What does it want? What do you do with a problem, I thought. I wanted to make it go away. I shooed it. I scowled at it. I tried ignoring it, but nothing worked. I started to worry about my problem. What if it swallows me up? What if my problem sneaks up and gets me? What if it takes away all of my things? I worried a lot. I worried about what would happen. I worried about what could happen. I worried about that, and I worried about this. I think I got the this and the that wrong. And the more I worried, the bigger my problem became. I wished it would just disappear. I tried everything. I even found ways to disguise myself, but it still found me. And the more I avoided my problem, the more I saw it everywhere. I thought about it all of the time. I didn't feel good at all. I couldn't take it anymore. This has to stop, I declared. Maybe I was making my problem bigger and scarier than it actually was. After all, my problem hadn't really swallowed me up or attacked me. I realized that I had to face it. So even though I didn't want to, even though I was really afraid, I got ready and I tackled my problem. When I got face to face with it, I discovered something. My problem wasn't what I thought it was. I discovered it had something beautiful inside. My problem held an opportunity. It was an opportunity for me to learn and to grow, to be brave, to do something. It showed me that it was important to look closely because some opportunities only come once. So now I see problems differently. I'm not afraid of them anymore because I know their secret. Every problem has an opportunity for something good. You just have to look for it. So I'm hoping, I've heard a lot of sermons, probably so have you, and I can't remember most of them. A few of them I can. I'm hoping actually you'll remember this sermon. You'll remember a couple things about it. One is that I brought a rock. Another is that I read you an interesting story. So there's at least a couple things you might take away that has a point. And I hope that the point that every problem has an opportunity kind of underlines what it has to say about Peter. So Craig came to me a couple months ago and said, hey, maybe you want to preach at some point this summer, and we're doing this series, and I was kind of hesitant. And I'm mulling on what I might want to say to you, and as I thought about my life and what Jesus has taught me, and as you get older, I find it easier to encapsulate what it is that Jesus has taught me. I'm 66 almost. And what is it that God has taught me, what Jesus has taught me during my journey with him? And interestingly enough, it's pretty much a thing that I learned a long time ago, and it just keeps coming back. So a bit of my backstory. So Craig said, hey, use this as an opportunity. People get to know you a little bit. A bit of my backstory, I was raised Anglican. We were very active. We lived in the United States. We were very active in the Episcopal Church. Moved to Toronto, where we totally disconnected from church. And I remember being the voice in my family's like, why don't we reconnect to church? And actually having an interest to reconnect with church, but my parents were not interested. We moved from Toronto to Vancouver, and in Vancouver I was quite lonely, and there was this thing called the I Found It campaign, which I could see one nod. You have to be of a certain vintage to remember the I Found It campaign, about my vintage or older. It was an advertising. Somebody had this idea that, hey, we could actually sell the Christian faith. So they created this big, huge media campaign, the I Found It campaign. And later on, I heard there were claims that nobody ever came to know Jesus through the I Found It campaign. And actually, I think I came to know Jesus. So I know of myself and one other person who, through the I Found It campaign, became Christian. So one of my partners in biology had recently become a Christian. He was attending a Brethren assembly on the North Shore of Vancouver, and so he asked me along to go to church with him, or to the assembly with him, and I discovered that there were a whole bunch of neat people there. However, I also discovered that particular church was going through struggles, and there were some things I didn't really enjoy about being involved with that church, so sort of fell away from it, and started university, disconnected from church. And When I was at university, I remember back in the day, the pre-computers, back in the day, I had written a major paper. My first major paper was for a geography course, and I remember the professor coming in a fairly small class and saying, "Hey, Mr. Lewis, I haven't received your paper yet." And I was like, "What?" Like I had spent hours and hours writing this paper. "Of course you got my paper. What are you talking about?" So I was just freaked out. It was like 40% of my mark. I had no backup because this was pre-computer. And so what's going to happen? Like, this is horrible. So I remember going to the washroom. I was going to Simon Fraser, and I sat sitting in the washroom, and I was like, "God, if that paper gets found, I'll go back to church." So, paper was found. And I reluctantly went back to church. And that was the beginning of a more intentional connection between me and the church. A couple of years later into my journey, I decided I wanted to get baptized. My parents were very, very resistant to that process. They said, "You had been baptized as a child, you don't need to be rebaptized." Eventually, we got to a point where I was going to be baptized, and you had a choice. You could either give your testimony, or the pastor could ask you a question, do you accept Jesus? So I decided to give my testimony, and I remember I unpacked, probably did misjustice to a particular Bible passage, but it sticks with me, and I think it was 2-point, actually, notwithstanding that the exegetes amongst us might say I butchered the passage. And it was a passage from Revelation where Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if anyone will open the door for me, I will come in, and I will eat with them, or I will have sup with them," depending what translation you're reading. And for the congregation, when I was being baptized, it said, for me, that passage has an entirely different meaning. It's as if Jesus stood at the door and knocked, and I began to open it. And the moment I opened it, he stuck his foot in. And then I tried to slam it shut, but his foot was in the door. And my journey, so I'm saying, that was when I was 20-ish. Now I'm 66-ish almost. And saying that's been the repeated learning of my life, is that Jesus has stuck his foot in the door. And that could be obnoxious at one level. I can't get rid of the guy. But it's also deeply affirming that Jesus cares so deeply that despite our best efforts sometimes, his foot is in the door. And that's been my journey, and that's part of what I've liked about Peter. As I was musing on who I wanted to talk a little bit about and pondering different people, Peter came to mind pretty quickly. And Peter, I'm going to cover in a few pieces of his story. One is the calling element of his story. But you should get really afraid if I stop following my notes, because then I just go off, which is what I'm doing, so be afraid. Peter, the calling portion, so I'm going to do Peter in 3 chunks fairly quickly. One is the calling portion. So one is Operation Andrew. So a little bit of my narrative, and again, trying to get to know people a little bit. As I grew up, as I first became a Christian, one of the homes I lived in for a while was the home of a guy named Jeff Still. Jeff actually was a Vancouver coordinator for the Billy Graham Crusade in the 1980s. So it was an interesting place to be living because I was interacting with the guy who was running the Billy Graham Crusade, and we get phone calls from various people in the Billy Graham organization. They would pop by. And as he was preparing, and he was enlisting everyone, including me, to help out to get ready for the Billy Graham Crusade, there was this thing, Operation Andrew, which I had never heard of, that was a huge part of the Billy Graham Crusade and the work that went into it. And Operation Andrew is based on a story that is related deeply to Simon Peter. And that is that when Andrew went and heard Jesus, he immediately went and found Simon, and said, "We have found the Messiah." So this idea of Operation Andrew, this whole narrative of Peter's life, is that actually immediately, there's this immediacy. And the interesting thing is when you think of the story of Peter and the rock, Simon, becoming Peter, the first time Jesus uses that frame is actually Andrew's gone and gotten Simon. Simon and him have gone to hear Jesus. Jesus sees him and almost immediately says, "You're Peter." First encounter. doesn't know him really at all. It's just, you're Peter. And Peter, if you don't know, isn't actually a name at this point. Cephas, Peter, is actually just a word. It means rock. So you're a rock. It's really an interesting thing for him to lead with. So we have this narrative of that's happened. Then we have a second piece of the narrative, which is the healing. So we have a story of Jesus coming to the home of Andrew and Andrew's mother-in-law, which we could probably talk a whole sermon on why the mother-in-law, and what an interesting statement that is, because mother-in-laws aren't particularly important in the narrative of the time, but I'm not going to go there right now. But she's suffering from a fever, and we're presuming it was pretty significant, that she was very sick, and that Jesus comes and heals her. And it's such an interesting story because immediately she gets up and starts serving them. Again, another sermon. But Peter, so let's imagine Peter's walk here, because we're going to get to a point of the call narrative of him. So he's experienced first encounter with Jesus as Andrew's coming, takes him out. Jesus immediately calls him Peter, the rock. He's wondering what. Then the meal, where the mother-in-law has been miraculously healed. And then we come to the call narrative. So I'm going to read for you this passage from Luke. I've got a couple of readings, so you don't have to stand for this. But one day, as Jesus was standing by the Sea of Galilee, my apologies, the original, I've changed it from the lake. The people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put it out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down there the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I'll let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. Pretty powerful narrative in several regards. One is, I want you to consider Peter and the evolution of Peter in the story itself. So remember, there's some context to this, and that the context is, okay, this is not first encounter with Jesus. This is at least third. So we've talked about the original meeting that Andrew facilitated. We've talked about the meal. Now we're fishing. And I want you to imagine that you're Simon, and you're in your boat, and you're tired, and you've been fishing all night. And you haven't just arrived back at the shore. You've actually unpacked your nets and are in the process of cleaning them, which is a piece of work itself. So it's not like you're just, we're rowing up to shore. Oh, there's Jesus. We're actually out washing the nets. We're done. We're tired. We're exhausted. And the carpenter says, "Hey, go back out and try again. Go further this time." And I don't think it's just me, but I'm reading some exasperation in Simon. What? We've been out all night. But I'm also reading an acquiescence. There's exasperation, but there's also, he's encountered Jesus already. He's had this experience with Andrew. He's seen the mother-in-law be miraculously healed. And there's a reluctance, but there's also an acquiescence. There's a sense of, okay, the master's calling me. He's asking me to do something. And when I mused on this passage and I mused on my own life, this reluctant yes, when I said to you that narrative of Jesus stuck his foot in my door, there's a sense of that about this story, is that actually Peter reluctantly says, you know, you're worth listening to. I don't really want to, but I'm going to anyway. Because you've established credibility with me, we'll go out and do that. And we go out and the miraculous catch happens. In my own life, I mentioned a bit about Oscar, who was the lab partner, and the miracle of the essay, if we want to use that word for the essay. There was also there was a reluctant yes for me in that walk too. I had perceived in my life that I was actually going to become an academic. That was always my aspiration. So, my career path was, okay, I pretty much finished my bachelor's degree. I'm going to go now and take my master's and then go take a PhD and end up in the world of academia. But I was confronted with this guy named Jesus and felt significantly a sense of call. So I, like Peter, reluctantly said, yes, I'll follow Jesus. And I ended up going to seminary in Nova Scotia to Acadia Divinity School. So that's where I started my seminary. So the story doesn't end there, though. We move on to the middle. And Peter's middle, in many senses, is marked by failure. So we've had this call narrative, this reluctant yes, this following. We hit the middle chapter of Peter, and we see several failures. I've titled them The Failure of Courage. These will be stories that will be really familiar to most of you. The denial in the courtyard. Jesus has been arrested. He's sitting in the courtyard, and he denies Jesus 3 times. The same guy who was going to stand up with his sword and fight is now in the courtyard denying Jesus 3 times. The failure of faith, which I'm going to unpack a little bit more of this one, which is sinking on the water. And then the failure of arrogance. Super interesting story, another sermon on, which we won't, in Matthew 16, where Jesus unpacks that he's going to have to die. Peter says no. Jesus rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." So 3 failures, significant failures. In my own life, I talked about going to seminary, ended up coming back. I had a bit of a crisis of faith and ended up coming back to home. I got to seminary and found it very difficult and decided I didn't have the internal fortitude to do that and left seminary. I ended up completing seminary later in life. I think there's a sense of preparation here, and I just want to read. I'm just trying to find where I put it in there. Okay, I'm just going to wait a second. Sorry. This is me processing out loud why you're the first group and not the third group hearing this sermon. So the piece is first saying no. At one point in my life as well, so failures in what I would call in retrospect failures and what God does with failures. So I ended up going back to work for the bank, which I had done. I had been kind of a mid-level tier trainee, and I got a job as a kind of a management trainee. It was quite a prestigious job, and was sent to their college for credit training. I did a whole bunch of work there, have a finance background, and was having a bit of a, do I really want a bank moment? And put my name back out of contact to the denomination I work with and candidated it at Nanaimo First Baptist and for an associate role, and was called by Nanaimo First Baptist. And I had my courtyard moment. I'd already been to seminary and turned away. But for me, the courtyard moment was, so I have a calling to go to Nanaimo First Baptist. And I said yes. And then I got Elaine, because I was honestly having a panic attack. I got Elaine to phone them and say, Elaine's my wife if you don't know, and say that I was not going to actually go. So that was me. And in retrospect, looking at my life, that's often been a bit of a literally saying no to God moment. When God said go, and I said no. What God does with those failures is, I think, an interesting thing, because as I've stepped into my role right now, or my role that I'm just ending, but my previous role, the fact that I had gone to divinity school, I'd finished my Master of Divinity, the fact that I had a background in business, both became important parts of the story. As we look at Peter, and just in the interest of time, I'm looking at the clock here. As we look at Peter, I ask you to consider Peter before and after, and then we're going to just very quickly look at the sinking narrative, and I'll end on that. Peter, that we discover, is, as we first meet him, an impulsive kind of guy. He has this rep, right? He's the guy who swung the sword. Self-reliant. He trusts on his own strength and expertise. He's the fisherman. He knows what he's doing. He's also fearful. He's the guy who's hiding in the courtyard. He's fragile. He cracks under pressure. He's reluctant. He's the exhausted because you say so fisherman. But who is Peter who we end the narrative with if you look and you read through? Peter who is surrendered, who trusts Jesus. He's courageous. He preaches boldly. He faces prison. He's willing. He follows Jesus' instructions even when he's a bit reluctant to do so. And he's anchored. He becomes he becomes the rock for others. So I skipped a chunk in the middle, just in the sense of going, just before I come back to this, I'm going to give you my Darren's quick synopsis. I was going to read through the sinking narrative, but I'm just going to give you the quick synopsis. So we have a story of the boat and the sea and the storm, and Jesus walking out, and Peter crying out and saying, "Can I come out to you?" and walking out in the water for a few steps and sinking. And often when I've heard that story, I've heard it as a bit of a story of failure. There's a little bit of an edge of, wow, the guy walked on water for a few steps. It's always had that for me, but it's always been this sense of, but he failed, he sunk. And I want you to think on Jesus' response to that story and his response to Peter, and ask you to reconsider Jesus' response. There's actually a word, it says immediately, when Peter starts to sink, immediately Jesus reaches out and catches him, immediately. And I want you to consider that word and actually think of yourself as a parent cheering your child on, and your child stumbles. And maybe it's a sporting match, having watched the World Cup yesterday. So they take that kick and they stumble and they miss and they fall and they're upset. How do you react? Do you react with condemnation? They failed. Do you react with love? And I would ask you to put into context that failure of Peter when he steps out of the boat. I won't step off. When he steps out of the boat and starts to sink, that Jesus' reaction to him is that of the parent of the close friend who's responding totally out of love. Immediately, he reaches out to him. And that in our failures, actually, Christ is taking that as an opportunity to demonstrate his love. Remember I said to you in the previous slide about one of the weaknesses or failures of Peter was arrogance. I wonder what Peter would have looked like if he had walked across the water to Jesus. And I would posit that perhaps Peter's failure was a necessary part of him becoming who he became. And my final slide, is just a revisit of the points I was trying to make. Rock as a metaphor. And a question, I'm going to leave you 3 questions. What are the rocks in your life? For me, there's that picture that I frequently come back to of that foot in the door. I'm seriously, that's stuck with me forever. Whenever I'm having a moment, I'm like, and I need to be reminded that Jesus loves me, despite my abject failure. I remind myself, this is the guy who stuck his foot in the door, and it's still there. What are the rocks in your life? What are you struggling with? What necessary thing is God teaching you? That our struggles aren't just failures, they're moments of learning. What is God teaching you? And in your success and your failure, you're a work in progress to remember that. How can you let Jesus catch you?